Good morning, Commissioners, and welcome to our budget workshop for fiscal year 14-15. 6 years ago, we gathered in this chamber as our country and our community spiraled into the worst recession since the Great Depression. Revenues were plummeting, expenses like fuel and health care were rising, and unlike businesses that were seeing a decline in the demand for services as the economy headed south, the demand for city services was actually increasing. On that day, our city government made a promise to its residents. We pledged to reduce the size of government and do everything possible to keep money in the pockets of our residents and businesses when they needed it most. We promised to fight to preserve our core city services like police, fire, public works, and neighborhoods. We vowed not to raise taxes as long as possible during the recession. Every financial decision over the last 6 years has been made with those guidelines in mind, and I'm proud to say that those promises have been kept. The numbers speak for themselves. We have cumulatively reduced our city budget by nearly $380 million since 2003. At the same time, we've increased our investment in keeping our city safe by adding 188 police officers and firefighters. That investment means that Orlando continues to have more police officers per 1,000 residents than any major city in the state of Florida, and a fire department with the highest levels of accreditation possible. Even though our city's population has increased 33% since 2002, we've decreased our civilian workforce by 16%. 12 years ago, there was one city employee for every 87 residents. Today, we've shrunk that number to one civilian employee for every 139 residents. That's a direct result of our dedicated city staff stepping up and providing a higher level of service with fewer resources. As other cities across Florida raised taxes, declared financial emergencies, and raided their reserves, national organizations like the Pew Charitable Trust were lauding Orlando as a model of fiscal health because we maintained our reserves, we made our pension obligations, and we maintained a superior credit rating. And 6 years later, this financial stewardship and our commitment to living within our means has helped set the stage for Orlando's economic rebound. Permitting is up 60% since 2009. Home prices up double digits from a year ago. Commercial real estate is surging with $5 billion in sales just last year. Orlando's tech industry is getting noticed around the globe. And fresh off the news that the USTA will build its new headquarters at Lake Nona, our medical city was the feature of a Forbes article called How to Build a Great American City. CNN Money says we are, once again, one of the top cities in America that people want to move to. Our tourism industry just set a record by welcoming 59 million visitors to our community. And the city's largest taxpayer, Universal Orlando, is poised to break even more records with the expansion of the wizarding world of Harry Potter. A recent national survey ranked Orlando as sixth most friendly city in America for small businesses and gave us A-plus grades for our tax codes, our business licensing, zoning, and environmental regulations. All this means Orlando is poised for what may be the biggest year in our history as we look to create quality jobs and grow our economy. Now, while our economy is improving, our city budget is not in the same position. This is due in large part to statewide property tax reform that was passed in 2008. This caps the growth of property tax revenue a local government can receive. These revenue caps placed on the City of Orlando have limited our ability to recover in the same way our economy is recovering. In other words, our revenue can't keep pace with our growing economy. This same scenario is playing out in cities across Florida, many of which have drained their reserves and raised taxes during the recession. Once again, the numbers speak for themselves. The primary source of funding for core city services is local property taxes. In 2009, the city generated $137 million in property tax revenues. Last year, in 2014, the city generated $102 million because of revenues caps. That's a drop of more than $30 million. That equates to the entire amount of money the city spends on our families, parks, and recreation department. And that gap will likely get wider as the demand for city services increases in an improving economy. This means there is no way for our city to come close to generating enough revenue to cover the cost of its pre-recession budgets. More importantly, it means our city is not able to generate enough revenue to cover the lean basics budgets that we have adopted in order to endure the recession. This budget reality has been a focus of a series of City Council workshops over the last several months. And during these workshops, Commissioners, we've asked tough questions and we've looked at all manner of options for developing a balanced budget and addressing this ongoing structural imbalance. Do we keep cutting? Do we reduce police and fire protection? Do we cut after school and summer programs? Do we reduce park hours and community center hours? Do we reduce and eliminate services that residents depend on, like street maintenance? Do we pull back on the wise investments that we have fought so hard to maintain and that are now a key part of our recovery, like job creation catalysts, including our small business assistance programs, our efforts to both attract and grow the next generation of employers? Or do we resolve once more to make some difficult but necessary decisions to maintain our city services that we have and keep our city on track toward the vision we share for the future of the city beautiful? Commissioners, these decisions are not easy, but we weren't elected to do what's easy. We were elected to do what's right, and our citizens have entrusted us with doing what's right for them, for their families, and for our city. And the plan that we put together does what's right for Orlando, and it includes a combination of strategies that will help ensure the long-term health of our city. The first step is to continue cutting costs, reducing expenses, and finding efficiencies throughout our city government. I am proud of the culture of savings and efficiency that exists in our city's workforce. Programs such as GreenWorks, the city sustainability initiative, automated trash pickup, our switch to using Google email, all of these save millions of dollars each year. As part of our ongoing commitment to reducing costs everywhere possible, we are recommending a $17 million reduction to the general fund for 2014-2015. This is on top of the hundreds of millions of dollars that we have already cut. As the second step in our plan, based on the discussion at our workshops, we are formally proposing to increase the millage rate by 1 mil, from 5.65 to 6.65. Even with this adjustment, we'll still be collecting less revenue than we did in 2009, but it will be enough to prevent drastic reductions in core city services. Adjusting the millage rate combined with our commitment to reducing expenses will allow us to fill our budget gap. It will also allow us to correct the fundamental revenue imbalance caused by property tax reform, and in so doing, ensure that we keep our government on strong financial footing and safeguard Orlando's future. We don't take the decision to adjust the millage rate lightly, but it's important to look at this action in context. What will adjusting the millage rate mean? It means that the average homeowner will see an increase of less than $10 a month. Even with that slight increase, they will be paying less than they did in 2009. So think about that for a second. I can't think of too many services that cost less today than what they did in 2009. The average cell phone bill is 3 times higher than it was 5 years ago. The price of a gallon of milk has gone up 21%. The price of gas is up more than 50%. By asking residents to pay roughly the same amount they did in 2009, our city will be able to continue to deliver the superior services our residents depend on. And we'll be able to keep our priorities on track. Everything from the continued revitalization of downtown to our efforts to create next-generation careers, to ensuring that our streets and sidewalks are maintained, to our projects to reduce traffic congestion, to our children's initiatives, to maintain and expand our parks and green space, and, of course, to ensure that we continue to keep our city safe. To make sure that our residents have access to this information, we have created a special budget section on our website. Citizens can see all of the budget documents that we're going to talk about today. They can also use a special calculator to determine precisely what they will pay in property taxes. It's part of an ongoing commitment to showing our residents where their tax dollars go and why the spending is important. Now, as we talk about the future of our city, I think it's also important that we talk about our community venues. There may be some out there who see the news that Orlando has raised its millage rate and want to wave their finger in the air and say that money must be going to pay for those new venues. I think that it's fair that we challenge these sorts of claims head-on with the facts. 1% of our general fund budget is allocated for what we call our headline projects: Sunrail, the Amway Center, the Citrus Bowl, Dr. Phillips Center, and our new Major League Soccer Stadium. 1%. The majority of the funding for those projects comes from either tourist taxes or other outside funding. These funds can only be used for these types of community projects or to promote our tourism industry. That 1% of our general fund is a perfect example of an investment for our future. Already 300 contracts have been awarded to local companies to work on the venues, and more than 2,000 residents have been employed through the Blueprint Project. By investing a modest amount in these projects, we see a return on investment many, many, many times over. And we create a powerful economic engine that generates jobs. We continue to help make Orlando a place that attracts new residents, and we give those who live in our city the modern amenities that they deserve. In closing, I want to say thank you again to our city commissioners. Working together, this city council has helped our city achieve some remarkable accomplishments. We've helped better the lives of thousands of children and families. We've invested in entrepreneurs who are creating quality jobs, and we've helped reinvent Orlando as a place that young people want to live and grow, where they can have the careers of tomorrow and a quality of life that is second to none. Commissioners, this is a credit to your leadership, your willingness to roll up your sleeves and tackle the challenges before us, just like you're doing today. I am privileged to serve our residents in partnership with you. I'd also like to recognize our city employees, not only for their commitment to creating a culture of savings at City Hall, but also for the incredible job that they do in service to our residents every single day. Above all, I want to thank our residents for their partnership and for their faith in this government as we've worked together to overcome all of the challenges brought on because of the Great Recession. I am humbled and I'm proud to serve as mayor in a city where we don't back down from a challenge, and we don't shy away from making tough but necessary decisions because we love our city. That spirit and love for our city beautiful is what has guided our actions during this budget process. And that spirit and that love for our city beautiful is also what has allowed us to endure the recession and come out on the other side poised to build a better future for all of our families. That concludes my formal remarks, and I want to call on Rebecca Sutton, our Chief Financial Officer, to deliver our budget presentation. Rebecca.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. Thank you for this opportunity to come and speak with you this morning and to present our 2014-15 budget for your review. What we hope to accomplish today is that first we'll review the budget process that we've undertaken to date. Second, we're going to review some very important facts for you to consider in evaluating this year's budget and actions that I will propose. Third, we will review the 2014-15 budget, both expenditures and revenues, in some level of detail. Fourth, I'll present the requested action of the City Council. And then last, we'll review the remaining events that we have in this year's budget calendar. First, I want to review this year's budget process. Last year, we informed the Council that we were projecting that all of our unspent prior year revenues would be fully consumed in the 2013-14 fiscal year. As you know, since, as the Mayor indicated just a few minutes ago, beginning in 2009-10, we began to reduce our budgets, we began to contract government, we cut expenditures, and we tried to live essentially within a very difficult, shrinking property tax picture. To get through this process, we were very frugal. Many of the years that we spent less than we had programmed. for those budget years, and that money was rolled over to the following year so that we could avoid increasing taxes. However, as inflation continued to raise the expenses that we had for this contracted government, we have now consumed all of the unspent prior year revenues, and we are projecting that there will be none at the end of this fiscal year. As a result, we started this process much earlier this year than any other year since I've been here. I came in 2005. And we wanted to be sure that there was sufficient time for you to consider the alternatives that you had to address this issue. Beginning in April, we've had 5 workshops and 2 rounds of commissioner briefings on this topic. And as we move through the next few months, we will remain available to commissioners so that you can get your questions answered. If you want additional briefings, if you want additional information, we'll stand by to provide that for you. There are a number of important facts to consider regarding this budget year. The mayor referred to this in his remarks earlier, but I want to reemphasize it. People often get confused with government's accounting, and it's not always clear from the news reports that our financial picture is segmented into different discrete parts that don't share resources. I kind of compare it to a strip shopping center. Each store in our shopping center is separate and must keep its financial resources and positions walled off from other parts of that particular shopping center and within the city. For instance, if we have issues in one particular area of the city, we don't take money from another area of the city, another one of these areas, to take care of a shortfall. It is a very different kind of environment that than you'll find in a lot of businesses. When we create new projects funded from funds other than our tax base, those projects are discretely funded and accounted for and will not access other funds unless there's a direct and logical benefit to those other funds and participation is vetted and decided upon by appropriate boards or commissions. The newsworthy projects that the city have done in the past 10 years have had less than 1% impact on the general fund and absolutely has not contributed or caused this budget situation that we have this year in the general fund. I think it's a little known fact that if we add all of the tax revenues, that includes sales tax, municipal revenue sharing, communication services tax, utility services tax, and property tax, we don't pay for our police and fire service. So taxpayer dollars, that term, is sometimes used very generally when it doesn't apply. Traditionally, this organization has made our public safety job one. Our reduction of non-public safety government has supported the growth of public safety over the period from 2000 to today. In fact, public safety has grown more than the general fund as a whole in dollars. $89.8 million increase for public safety, with a reduction in non-public safety over that same time of $18.8 million, making the total general fund increase $71 million over that time. Personnel has increased in fire and police by 178 positions, while the other departments have reduced by 347 positions. And as you can see from the slide, the percentage of our public safety has grown dramatically over this time from a percentage of general fund. Even with the $1 million tax increase that the mayor has indicated to us, by the way, we've used this slide several times this year to show the fact that our tax revenues have not kept up with inflation. Even with that $1 million increase, we're still behind the inflationary curve for property tax. But we're not only considering revenue enhancements in the absence of other considerable expenditure cuts. In fact, since 2003, there's been a cumulative total of $379 million cut from general fund budgets over that period of time. And we've cut even just since 2009, $232 million, just since the recession started. Of these cuts, $41 million per fiscal year remain in place, and they're in the 2015 budget. This represents a substantial savings over this period to the taxpayers. I think another point that we need to review is the history of our ad valorem tax rates here in the city. Prior to September 2001, the city had maintained a tax rate of $6.66 for many, many years. At that point, the city reduced its tax rate to $5.69.15 in response to direction from the Florida legislature. In 2008, our tax rate was further reduced to $4.93.07 and was restored the following year to $5.65, where it has remained throughout the economic downturn. However, this tax rate can no longer support the operations of the city. Brian Battles, our division manager of the Management and Budget Division, will now come to present the details of the 2014-15 budget.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. As you heard, my job today is to give you some of the details, both on the revenue side and the expense side. So first, some of the higher level highlights of this budget. It does include all negotiated cost of living adjustments are included in the expenditure budget. It also includes no new positions. It does include our budgeted actuarial required contribution for all three pension funds and our OPEB fund. We have in this budget increased our contingency from past year to allow for the continuation of the Safer Firefighters once those grant funds expire. And last, as Rebecca talked about, this budget does not include the use of reserves of prior unspent revenues from years past. Some of our high-level revenue, we talked about providing updates in the past. We have finalized all of these numbers from the state legislature as well as our own internal estimates and presenting here with the numbers. I will point out that the property tax number here is prior to any millage adjustment at an increase of $6.5 million. It is 31% of our budget without the mill, and it will increase to 34% with that additional increase. Our utility service tax, as in past years, we have seen a decrease. It's about 13% of our general fund budget, mainly due to communication services tax decreasing as well as some user conservation efforts. I do want to point out that while this is decreasing, it has decreased this year less than in the past years. So hopefully we'll see a trend in the future better for our bottom line. State sales tax is averaging about $2 million a year in growth over the last 3 years. Here we're getting from the state estimates a $3 million increase. Our municipal revenue sharing is growing about $500,000 a year. And our business tax has been steady around $7.5 to $8 million over the last couple of years. As I noted, you will see a large decrease in the other revenue, and what that really includes is the $29.5 million prior use of unspent fund balance in past years not being included in this budget. And the main increase for the transfers in amount is funding our school resource officer program through our contraband and forfeiture trust funds rather than through our general fund. Some of the kind of highlights of the property tax number, it did rise by, taxable base did rise by 7.5%. After you take in discounts and some of the other calculations, you'll get back to that 6.5% increase that we've heard in previous presentations. The net new taxable value, or the new construction number, as some people note, was $402 million. However, I did want to point out that the exempt value did increase by 4.2% at the same time. And again, the table on the next page does not include any type of millage adjustment. So as you see, the trend for property tax. Again, the trend for utility service tax, slightly lower this year, but hopefully on the upswing in the future. Sales tax, Again, roughly $2 million average increase this year with that $3 million increase. Municipal revenue sharing, the state estimate actually had this at a higher value than what we've been seeing historically. So we've reduced this down to make sure, again, our conservative approach on the revenue side, we don't ever want to budget more expenses than what our revenues can sustain. And this is one of those categories that we chose to more align it with our activities that we've seen in the past. And again, the local business tax. We'll point out that the franchise fee dividend from OUC is an agreed upon rate. This year it did increase by $5 million with additional increases hopefully in the next few years to be agreed upon as well. Now moving into the general fund expenditure side. As you see, our continued commitment to public safety with police and fire both up, police up $4.8 million, roughly 33% of our general fund budget, with fire up $3.8 million, comprised of 24% of our general fund budget. Both of these increases were mainly due to cost of living and step increases that were negotiated, as well as pension increases that we've seen for those two organizations. Again, another increase, the economic development is mainly of $1.6 million, is mainly related to additional operating expenditures in our permitting activity, as well as some minor increases due to Sunrail station maintenance. As you see, the bottom line of our general fund expenditures is at $370 million, or a $9 million growth. Again, if you notice a few slides ago, the revenues that we're projecting are at 352. The next few slides are kind of a very high level of our department budgets, total budgets, as well as staff counts. I think you heard a lot of very in-depth presentations a few meetings ago from each of our departments, so I don't want to belabor all their activities, but just kind of wanted to point out the high level of what these budgets include. Again, most of these departments are both general funded and other funded activities. Executive offices coming in at $79 million, with the other funds budget consisting mainly of the healthcare fund and a staff count of 150. Business and financial services at $75 million. It's about 7% of our total budget, with the other funds comprised of fleet, facilities, and risk. The staff count is about 8% of our citywide total, and it includes the divisions that you'll see at the bottom of the page. Economic development at $83 million. It's about 8% of our total. The other funds largely are part of the CRA operating and the CRA trust funds, as well as the building code fund. Operating expenses is about 80% of their total budget, and a staff count of 184. I appreciate you bearing with me as I go through these numbers. We'll continue with Families, Parks, and Rec, $30 million, which is only about 3% of our budget. And the other funds comprised of mainly the After School All-Stars Fund, with a staff count of 204, or roughly 7% of our total staffing. Fire Department at $112 million is about 11% of our total, with the other funds portion largely about 99% coming from the Emergency Transport Fund, and a staff count of 592, or 19% of our total budget, with 523 sworn. Housing and community development, largely funded by the grants that you'll see at the bottom. Operating expenses at $6 million, a staff count of 20 employees, or roughly about 1% of our total staffing. And Orlando venues, $40 million is about 4% of the total. Again, being highly an enterprise fund, you'll see the venues such as the Amway Center, Citrus Bowl, Lewin Manello Museum comprised of the other funds portion of this department. Police at a total budget of almost $38 million. It's roughly 14% of our total. The other funds comprised of the GOA fund at about $10.5 million, with a staff count of 995, or about 32% of our total positions, and 760 sworn employees. Public Works at $204 million is about 20% of our total budget. As you can see, it's heavily on the enterprise fund with the other funds. Wastewater revenue fund coming in at about $85 million, stormwater at $23 million, solid waste at $30 million, parking at $15 million. Our large components of that other funds, $185 million, with a staffing count of 635 employees, or about 20% of the total. And then we have the non-departmental, which is comprised mostly of our pension funds, OPEB, some of the citywide activities that are not really designated to one particular department, such as gas tax or CIP that are shared from a few different areas, coming in at $265 million, about 26% of the total. One of the questions that we've gotten a few times is how the $15 million will be allocated across the departments. I did want to point out that fire at 4.6 and police at 6.5, so roughly over $11 million of the $15 million will be that across the board cut to those two departments. And this has already been programmed into the budget as we've discussed with that reduction. Some of the citywide cost increases that have made up this year's numbers. Again, with salaries and benefits, we had the cost of living adjustments. It's estimated about $3.5 million annually. Steps are about $2.5 million annually. Our pension contributions, as I noted, increased this year by $2.7 million. Our health care citywide increased by about $5.1 million. With increased property taxes, we also have, on the flip side, increased payments to our increment areas. That increased by roughly $1 million this year, as well as some of our fleet and facility costs due to delayed maintenance, as well as fuel costs, roughly almost $800,000. So again, to balance our budget, our general fund with revenues at $352 and expenses at $370 has roughly a $17 million spread, as well as the other funds, which makes up over about 70 different funds at this point in time, are fully balanced and ready to go. With that, I'll turn it back over to our CFO, Rebecca Sutton, to talk about some recommended actions for this budget. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Before I discuss our requested action, I want to once more emphasize that this budget not only includes the continuation of many years of belt tightening totaling over $26 million in this year's budget, it also contains an additional $15 million across-the-board cut, as was just presented to you, and then an additional $2.5 million school resource officer support from our contraband forfeiture trust fund. $17.3 million of expenditures have been cut from this budget prior to my asking for a millage increase of 1 mil. This will produce $17.3 million net of our CRA increment payments that will balance this budget. While a tax increase is never welcome news, I wanted to show you that even with this increase, the amount paid by the average homeowner will still be less than they paid in 2009, and it's also behind adjusted inflation, or inflation-adjusted 2009 levels by $77.50. And for average commercial property, the contrast is even greater. These properties will pay substantially less than the 2009 on the average and will remain lower than inflation-adjusted 2009 levels by almost $7,000 annually. But as the mayor indicated, even with this tax increase, we are not returning yet to the 2009 property tax levels. For our citizens and other interested parties, we invite you to visit our website at www.cityoforlando.net/budget for many budget facts and figures, our budget and brief document, all of our budget presentations this year, and a tax calculator, as the mayor referred to. You can type in your address on this calculator, and it will show you your 2009, 2014, and 2015 taxes so that you can determine the exact impact that it has on your household or your business. Lastly, we need to once again review our budget calendar. Today we have on the council agenda the adoption of the preliminary millage rate. This is not the final adoption of this tax rate, but simply the adoption of a rate which will be used on this year's trim notice, which will be issued on August the 14th. On September 8th and 15th, we'll have our required hearings, at which time you'll finally adopt the tax rate and approve the 2014-15 budget. This budget will be activated on October 1st, 2014, the first day of our fiscal year. I want to take this opportunity to recognize the extraordinary work done by our budget staff, not only in my office, but across the city. If any of you are in the audience, will you please stand and be recognized? Without their hard work and dedication, we could not complete this process. And I want to thank you also for your attention this morning and the support that you have given me and the rest of my office as we've worked through this very difficult budget year. With that, Mayor, I will take questions that you may have.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, budget team. I know you've been toiling a lot of hours over the last 3 months, and today I don't think there was any new information. I think it was more of a summary of what we've been talking about for the last 3 months, but it was well presented and I think makes a very good case for the actions that we're taking. So thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, budget team. All right, questions, comments, thoughts, anybody? Commissioner Sheehan.
Thank you, Mayor. I think there's a couple things, and Rebecca, thank you so much, and thank you, budget team, because I know this has not been easy. I mean, I worked for state government prior to coming to city government, and it's always been cut, 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 cut. It's never been a good year. I remember when I first got elected, we'd always have a surplus, and it was like, how are we going to spend the surplus? And it was always fun and games, and it was happy. Let's do a community center. Let's do this. Let's do that. And hasn't been that way in a long time. So I know it's been a very difficult job. It's never fun to deal with cuts. It's always better to deal with surpluses, and we've never had those, since a lot of you've been here. So thank you for your very, very hard work. I think I'd like to just reiterate a couple of the things from the presentation to explain why I support this increase. The average homeowner is paying less today than 2009. I'm not paying less for anything, than I paid for in 2009. Less than 1% of the budget is for headline projects. The enterprise funds are for specific purposes. I think that's something that people need to understand. That's as close as we get to running like a business as anything in government can be, because we're taking in the money needed to do things like stormwater projects and things like that for very, very specific purposes. So we don't raid one fund to pay for something else like they do in the legislature, which I think is wrong. I've heard some folks say, well, why don't you all just tighten your belts? Well, if you look at the gas increases alone, if you think about we're having to run police vehicles, fire trucks, garbage trucks, street sweepers alone, whenever there's a big influx in the cost of gasoline alone, it's millions and millions of dollars, and I don't hear anybody saying, don't run the fire trucks, don't send the police vehicles out, don't pick up my garbage. We never hear that. So again, we can't do what an average homeowner does with belt tightening, because we still have to provide these very necessary services that are even necessary to the public health and safety. I think it's important for $26 million in savings and cuts to date. And something that's really been distressing to me is that the property tax reform for commercial properties is really a big portion of what caused this structural imbalances, especially since commercial properties use more services. They call the police more, they call the fire department more. They use more services, and this, by voting for property tax reform, the average homeowner actually kind of messed themselves up, because, again, they've passed the savings on to commercial properties, which are actually the ones using most of the services. They're the ones that do that. So, again, it was an unanticipated consequence of voting against your own self-interests. So, again, I'd like to thank the budget staff for their very, very hard work. This is a very difficult situation to be in, but, again, we're still less than where we were many, many years ago, and we're going to continue to provide the necessary services to the citizens of Orlando. And Mayor Dyer, thank you. I know this is never fun either, but, again, this is as a result of a very difficult situation that we put in by the legislature and by folks that don't understand the budgeting process, and we need to make a difficult decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor. And Rebecca, thank you and your staff for the work that you've done. I've just got a couple of questions I want to make sure that I understand, and then kind of get to one core piece that I think some of the constituents that I deal with don't quite understand. So I'll make sure I'm not saying something out of line. I'm looking at the impact of the 1 mil. It's towards the end of your presentation, 1 mil on the average commercial industrial property. And asking, I guess, probably for the sake of our question, is that we're at $14 million there in 2009 and basically at $8 million. It seems to me that that is probably a combination of a couple of things. One is the valuation of the commercial property going down, and then the lack of its increase coming back up based upon the legislature's 10% cap on commercial property. At least I'd say I'd call it Save Our Businesses cap. Is that true? Is that the core of those?
It's partially true. I think it can be attributed at least partially to that. The other attribution is that the values have not yet come back to the 2009 level. So it's a combination of the two.
Yeah.
There is significant difference between values still between then and now.
And with this, at this level, just kind of assuming nothing in cost of living increase, at this level we're roughly at $8 million. If you increase 10% per year to get back to the 14 million, if we could get to the maximum, just based upon no new construction, you're really looking at about 6 or 7 years just to get to that core, assuming no new construction, just to make up that gap to get us where we were to a commercial standpoint,
Yeah.
because of limitations that legislature and the voters put onto us.
Assuming no inflation.
Yeah.
Right. No inflation.
inflation.
No new
Which
construction. Which
I
I mean,
think
those
we can
are
all agree probably isn't going
Yeah.
to happen.
Yeah.
But just keeping that, keeping essentially that unchanged,
Yeah.
it would be at least that much time. Yeah.
And that's the case, Commissioner, even if somehow magically tomorrow everything went back to 2009 property values, you're exactly right. We would still take 6 years to catch up.
right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Even if those property values went back up, keep in mind that we are limited in what we can recognize from that.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that property values continue to rise, the amount that's attributable to property tax reform becomes greater as we move forward.
Yeah. It in a sense, it reminds me of a little bit how Texas has done their municipalities, which is by just breaking up all their counties so that everybody's in a municipality, and all of a sudden that municipality controls their costs. In our case, what they're doing effectively is creating a reason for us to begin annexation everywhere we possibly can, which is the silliest thing in the whole world. We shouldn't have a financial reason to do annexation. We ought to do it for services and do it because of the demand of the people that are there. But here, the only real way to get back to the level we want to get is to bring in new property to get us up to that level, and that seems to be nearly fiscally impossible for us to accomplish. We cannot bring in property fast enough. So that's a quick editorial comment. Going backwards, back in the same one, the balance, you have a one titled FY 2015 summary budget balancing, and it shows the general property. I guess I want to make sure from the standpoint of what you said in your recap. This is right before the recommended action form. These aren't numbered. I apologize. I would give you that. But it shows revenue at $352 million, expenses at $370 million, and what is not clear on this form, I think clear in your description later on, is the $370 million already includes $17.3 million in cuts.
Yes, it does.
And then there's, in addition to that, a $17.3 million. And I guess the question is, because those numbers are kind of rounded off and close to each other, I want to make sure that we understand that those really are two separate numbers, and they aren't kind of one versus the other.
Yes, I think it's probably important to note that as we began our analytical processes, and continue those analytical processes through this budget year. We kind of, I guess we had to have some assumptions that we made. And one of the assumptions that we made was that there could not be more than a mill increase. That was just something that we used as a straw man. That's not to say that the council might not decide to do something different. But we felt like that we had to do some budget closing activities to get to that number. It's not a coincidence that that's equal to a mill, because we target it to not be more than a mill. And so as a result, we did some adjustments of timing on a few things that we could do. And I guess we did some additional cuts, some additional fine-tuning, I guess I would say, of some of the numbers. To some extent, it was a process that we went through to get to that number. But I think as well, we were fortunate to be able to find the things that were necessary to be able to achieve that.
Yeah. Two other quick questions. I don't want to take up too much time. Back to the history of the ad valorem tax rates. One of the things I'd like to kind of do, and maybe I'll just kind of dig it up myself, is that there were some rollback rates that were allowed by us. Those rollback rates were actually, because of how the calculation was an increase. And I know that the rollback rate really is a combination of what the state allows us to do with a simple majority from this board. That's what it kind of does. But what I'd like to kind of see, and maybe we can dig it up from the actual minutes, is that what are those rollback rates for these years, so that the citizens of Orlando can see that we chose not to take the previous year's rate that we were allowed to do and stayed steady at 5.65. I mean, that was kind of those things. Now, the long term is the rollback rate eventually gets closer or goes below where we are, but now the property tax sets in, and then it always will have that problem. So, I mean, we've created that issue. But I'd like to see that, and maybe we'll dig a little bit to see what we could have done and we chose not to do because of the impact on our citizens.
Yes, the rollback rate was significantly higher than the actual tax rate in both fiscal 10 and 11.
Yeah.
And we can pull those up for you.
I remember one year the rollback rate was like 9.1 mils.
Yes.
I mean, it was like
I
the
believe
rollback,
that was-
and we all kept saying, "What do you mean by rollback?" And you go up, 2 or 3 mils to go.
Yeah, that rate is calculated on what rate would be required to produce the taxes from the previous year.
Oh, the revenue, yeah. Yes.
So once that gets adjusted, and for instance, you see in this in that particular graph, we bottomed out, I think, in 12 or 13. I can't tell specifically here. Once you begin to go back up, then your rollback rate is higher.
Right.
Or I'm sorry, is lower
Right.
than your actual rate, because it is producing slightly more revenue than it did the previous year.
And I don't know how to communicate that in a way that is clear without, because this is so esoteric. We all kind of look at this from a different perspective, but it'd be nice to be able to kind of have some of the information to share. So I think we talked about it, but I know that's not important for today's meeting. The last thing, and probably the most important, and I think probably from my standpoint, is this. We have chosen not to reduce our reserves more than 25%. We have reserves of 25% currently. We have chosen in the past, as I understand it, so correct me if I'm wrong, in the past several years, we have excesses in our reserves from the previous year. We've applied those excesses to the following year, and that excess, as you've told us a couple of years ago, will eventually begin to narrow down based upon all these other tax revenue streams. There are other agencies that have other municipalities and jurisdictions that have a reserve of 7 or 8%. Ours, through the leadership of people 30 years ago, said we're going to be at 25% and we're going to stay there because that's an important number for us, and that's a good maximum number for us to have in a municipality. More than 25% looks to funders that we're hoarding money. Less than 25% looks like we're not doing a very good job in cash management. So 25% is that number we've kind of set as kind of that maximum goal. And it seems that many municipalities run about 10 to 25% in their reserves based upon how they've run historically. We've just chosen to always put that money there through the leadership of Mayor Frederick, Mayor Hood, even back into Mayor Langford. And that's been an important discipline that we've stayed with in this council that I've been here for 8 years. It's been an important discipline. So much of the idea that when we begin to start talking about this is that we've chosen not to dip beyond the 25% limit back into our reserves. We have that choice, and we could make that choice. Mm-hmm. But that choice from an operations standpoint is a dangerous path to go down, because you could be 5 years down the road dipping into that again and being at 8 or 9%. That has an impact on credit rating, how you borrow money, and that ends up being, it's kind of like borrowing from a credit card. There's a cost involved, and if you keep borrowing from the credit card, there's this hidden cost that you don't catch up till you're into it 6 or 7 or 8 years down the road. So, I mean, I want to make sure that that I'm clear on that. I think that's the case. And if I'm not, then just help correct me, and you can correct me in public if you want to.
I'll refrain from that. I think that you bring up a very good point. Our reserves can fluctuate sort of around that 25% level because we can't perfectly predict what our revenues are going to be each year. And generally, when we have variance in that 25%, it's because we didn't project perfectly, which, I think it's a pretty good chance we're not going to project perfectly every year. Sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's not. But I think the most important thing is just some information that I got this last year in discussing things with the rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. One of the things which they look at very, very closely is whether or not recurring problems are attempted to be solved from one-time sources. And a reserve is a one-time source. That's what creates a structural imbalance. We've explained to them that while we're using prior year unspent revenues, which technically is a one-time revenue, that we're doing so with an understanding that there is an end to that practice, and when we get to that end, we're going to have to do something that is recurring in nature, not one-time in nature. They have said, actually, I think it was actually written in one of their rating reports, that they are watching closely to see what we do so that we can continue to maintain our fine credit ratings here, because it is coming to these crossroads and making the right decision which gets us the very, very high marks in financial management that we have here. So I think it's an excellent point, and that, not plugging this hole this year with reserves only postpones the problem. Mm-hmm. And then when we get to that point where we have to face exactly the same problem again, we don't have the reserves. Right. So it's an important step for us to take here, both from the perspective of our credit ratings, which they basically said that if we don't do something recurring this year, that it will have a negative impact. We'll probably, at a minimum, go into a negative watch situation because we would not have done what we need to do. And I guess worst case scenario, some level of downgrade.
Yeah. And I guess prior to 2008, and I was only in here for just a couple of years, we had that ability to have some projection to know we were going to have some extra money coming into the reserves. And so we had a little bit of that. But the counter to all this is if somebody were tomorrow to say, hey, you guys are going to get a $30 million bump next year, we'd all say, well, let's take out our reserves and pop it back in. I mean, what's the big deal? But because we're having that limitation, because we're $33 or $34 million less per year than we were in 2009, we don't have that choice to kind of come back and say, let's borrow from reserves and put it back in because here's our promise coming back. Mm-hmm. I noticed that Lake County has increased theirs. I saw there was an increase in their millage, and so one of the things I'd like to maybe get a recap from you is what are other municipalities doing? How are they kind of addressing the same kind of issues? And I don't know what the broad picture snapshot would be, but it really would be a combination of how they're borrowing money, what their rating is, and what the reserves are, and are they actually going to charge more money for what they're doing? And I don't know. Everybody's going to address this. They're going to address it, either addressed it last year, they're going to address it this year, they're going to address it the next 2 years, because this is the fallout of limiting commercial development growth, limiting property tax. We're all going to have to address it. And so I would prefer to address it in a more aggressive way that doesn't lend us to be here next year going, I need 7%, I need 7 mills, I need 8 mills, I need 9 mills. I mean, let's get this back to that even keel that we were in 2009. Allows us to kind of have that fluctuation. So anyway, with that in mind, I'm sorry for taking too much time, but I appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll move to Commissioner Ings.
Thank you, Mayor. I forgot what I was going to say.
That was like one of your commissioner reports.
Well, and maybe that's where he was trying to take advantage of. But actually, Rebecca, thank you, and Brian, for your presentation to us today. But on page 13, specifically dealing with other revenue of the 67 million, and then the change of 27 million, and maybe I missed it, but what other areas, or what areas did this other revenue actually come from?
Okay. The change in that, when we use prior year unspent revenues to balance the budget, as we did in the 2013-14 year, that is put in other revenue. So you had $29 million in your $67 million number in the 2014 budget, which were prior year's revenues that were rolled forward.
Okay.
As I indicated in our presentation, we don't have any more.
Okay.
So there's nothing to
Nothing
put there.
to roll forward.
All right. And so essentially, if you take that out, we're about a $2 million increase actually in other revenues, not a $27 million decrease if you take those prior year revenues out of the picture.
Okay. Okay. Because I was looking also at page 34 where we look at the 2015 proposed budget and the shortfall of 17 million, and I was wondering from that compared to page 13 with the 27 million, we just missed it by a little bit.
Well, we didn't do that. We ran out of that source of funding
Right.
in the 2014 budget. So we don't have that to fall back on.
Right.
If we had that to fall back on, then that might have been our solution so that we could postpone this one more year. But it would only be a postponement. It's only a postponement. It's not a permanent fix.
Right. And and when we talked during briefing times, and I think I even asked the question, why not 1.5 mil or 2 mil, concerning this particular increase, because really I was reluctant to go to even the 1 mil. But through your briefings and obviously your presentation here today, I understand why we have to do this, and even the public, I think, probably understands a little bit more, but I just hope that the public has an opportunity to kind of weigh in a little bit. And when do they have an opportunity to speak concerning this?
Okay. As is the case each and every year, we are required to have 2 public hearings on our budget and our tax rate. And that will occur on the 8th of September and the 15th of September at 5:01 p.m. And we will take public comment at that point.
Okay. Because, Mayor, I was going to ask you if we could move budget item B11 to new business so we can allow for public input, but
We follow a statutory procedure, so
Right.
we're not actually adopting the millage rate. What we're
Right.
doing is that's the highest that we could set the millage rate, and you actually set it in the September hearings, and we'll take public input at that point.
Right.
And actually, I think in the 11 years that I've been here, we've only had 1 year where we had anybody show up at one of those workshops. But that was the year that we raised the millage rate back, and we had about 8 people.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Rebecca.
Commissioner Hill.
Thank you, Mayor. Rebecca and staff, I just publicly want to say thank you for helping me for hours at a time on briefing me and bringing me up to speed on city business and the budget. which is tough. Taxes are tough for our residents and business owners. But what I found out through the budget is something that's needed. My concern was programs and public safety. And when I saw that we wasn't going to have to cut our social services and programs and lay city employees off, and our police department staffing was going to be secure, and the fire department was going to be secure. And these are things that also affect the residents and also our commercial business owners, because they also take part in these services. So I am in support of this, because it pains me, but it would be a travesty if we have to touch those programs, because the whole city will be affected by that. So I just want our citizens to know that this is a needed solution. It's not the whole solution, but it heads us towards closing this gap. And I see so much economic development going on here in the city, and so many residential buildings coming up out the ground, to where I foresee here in the near future, as they say, that a few years from now, that that we will be out of the red and back in the black. And that's just, it's no questions. It's just where I wanted to state my mindset on moving forward with this millage increase.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any further comments or thoughts? Once again, budget staff and Rebecca, great job. You guys get to come out here for a couple hours every once in a while. We know that for the last 9 months you've been toiling away up in your offices helping us get to this day and into the public hearings in September. So we certainly appreciate all those hours that have been spent on this budget. That concludes our budget workshop for the day.